Tonight at 10, the latest evidence of ambulance services struggling to cope with rising demand. Most services are unable to respond to emergency calls on time, and the pressure has risen dramatically in the past 2 years. Part of the problem is the long delay in handing over patients at hospital A&E departments.
We've then got patients waiting for ambulances to arrive, but we can't go to them because we're waiting to sort of hand over our patients.
And another factor is the increasing workload caring for the elderly. We'll have the details of a BBC investigation. Also tonight, 15 police forces in the UK have now established inquiries into allegations of historical child sexual abuse in football. The plane, which crashed with the Brazilian football team on board, had apparently run out of fuel, according to a cockpit recording. Donald Trump says he will sever ties with his business empire when he enters the White House to avoid any conflicts of interest. And we're on the trail of art treasures held in mysterious storage facilities around the world.
And here in the south, under pressure, a huge increase in emergency calls, the ambulance crews in the south at full stretch. And a crime that can destroy lives. Police here call for victims of sextortion to come forward.
Good evening. A BBC investigation has found that most ambulance services are unable to respond to emergency calls on time, partly because of the long delay in handing over patients at hospitals. Ambulances in England, Wales and Northern Ireland spent more than 500,000 hours waiting at A&E departments in the past year, and that is a rise of some 52% over the past 2 years alone. And across the UK, 12 of the 13 ambulance services are not meeting the 8-minute target for reaching emergency cases. The ambulance service in Wales is the only exception. Our health editor Hugh Pym has been investigating.
Ambulance emergency, is the patient breathing?
Ambulance service, can you tell me exactly what's happened?
She's an 85-year-old patient, query having a stroke.
They're covering emergencies 24/7, but ambulance services are facing unprecedented pressure. It's all part of the wider strain in the NHS across the UK. I spent a day with the South Central Ambulance Service in Oxfordshire. Dealing with calls to the elderly is an increasing part of their day's work. Florence, who's 92, has been in and out of hospital and is cared for by her daughter.
We've gone to get some gas and air, sweetheart. We're on it. It's all right, Dad. It's okay. We're going to look after her now, okay?
They discuss arranging treatment close to home, but decide hospital is the only option. A patient in her 90s, she's had breast cancer before, she has bladder cancer now, and she's suffering from acute pain because of an infection. In so many ways, it's the story of the modern NHS, caring for the needs of an ageing population. They get to the hospital quickly enough, but there are hold-ups in getting her admitted.
There was a delay just because they didn't have a bed available for her, so we had to find somewhere where we could put her. So they've managed to find a chair for her for now until a bed becomes available.
Is that hurting?
Oh, in here too.
Okay, let me listen to the back of your lungs.
Across the county, another paramedic is called to see Audrey, who's complaining of chest pains, but it becomes clear things are more complex.
Okay. So don't get
Her husband and sole carer, Bill, is struggling to cope with her dementia. Despite no serious medical problems, she'll have to be admitted to hospital where her condition can be managed. Care of the elderly is an increasing part of the caseload, but all ages, including a woman in her 30s with a history of heart trouble, need attention. This baby was severely dehydrated and needed urgent hospital treatment.
Do you know how much she weighs?
Around the UK, delays handing over patients at hospitals, sometimes more than an hour, are causing frustration for paramedics.
The hospitals, they don't have the room, they don't have the places to put them. So we're there waiting with patients. We've then got patients waiting for ambulances to arrive, but we can't go to them because we're waiting to sort of hand over our patients.
Are you diabetic?
That's okay, so I don't do that. That's absolutely
Have you
fine.
had any head injuries?
No,
at all
that's no worries.
Call volume is rising, patient numbers are increasing, and because of the pressure, the target for 75% of urgent ambulance calls to arrive within 8 minutes is being missed in most parts of the country. NHS England knows there's a problem and is trying out new ways of assessing calls.
I think we need to look at the targets across the board because the vast majority of patients who dial 999 aren't in an immediately life-threatening condition. And what we need to avoid doing is being inefficient in the way that we dispatch resources to those individuals.
First one's quite a large staff.
The Welsh service is the only one in the UK to hit the 75% benchmark. It's introduced a new procedure redefining emergency calls, but with far fewer in the most urgent category, and allowed operators more time to prioritise.
Having that extra time to ask those questions makes us then more smarter in the way that we allocate or dispatch the ambulance or RRV or whatever.
When it's a matter of life and death, ambulances will get there to handle serious injuries. The challenge is coping with all the demands coming their way, which is part of the bigger story of a stretched and pressurised health service.
Hugh was with me now. Let's talk a little more, Hugh, about the kinds of pressures we're talking about, which were obvious there in your report. We're talking really about demands which are more than the traditional emergency calls that we associate with the ambulance service.
Yes, Hugh, it's easy to see ambulances spending their whole time on serious road traffic accidents or life-threatening injuries. Thankfully, that's not the case, but they are spending more time on community health issues. If you like, picking up the pieces, often having to advise an elderly patient in their home what the best care options are when maybe an overworked GP practice can't help or social care hasn't worked out. And that's greatly stretching the range of things which ambulances are expected to do at a time when calls generally are going up, and there is this pressure at hospitals when they get delayed because they can't hand over patients because there aren't enough beds. Now, this can be addressed up to a point by refocusing, reprioritising, narrowing the definition of an emergency call so ambulances are sent to the right places, to the right patients, and getting operators to spend a bit more time to make the decisions. Now, that's what's happened in Wales with some success so far. Scotland is piloting a scheme like this, so too is England. But you can reset targets, you can redial if you like to try and meet them, but it is a system-wide issue which needs to be dealt with right across the NHS. All this pressure, and in England certainly with cuts in social care funding, that hasn't helped. And ambulance services that we've seen today are certainly not immune from all that.
OK, Hugh, again, thanks very much. Hugh Pym there, our health editor. Now, 15 police forces in the UK have now established inquiries into allegations of historical child sexual abuse in football. The Football Association has already announced its own internal review, and the former Newcastle player Derek Bell is the latest to say that he was sexually abused by a coach back in the 1970s, as our sports correspondent Natalie Perks now tells us.
It's one of the biggest crises the game has faced. The number of police forces investigating claims of historical sexual abuse in football is now into double figures. In the past fortnight, we've heard harrowing testimony from survivors, abused children who carried the burden of silence into adulthood, until finally they felt football was ready to listen. Derek Bell is one of them, a former Newcastle United player abused by coach and convicted paedophile George Ormond.
My dream was to play, professional football. So he got so much into my head that, he forced me to consent to these acts. Quite very intimate. I don't want to go into the exact detail, but, they're quite horrendous acts.
Several clubs have been embroiled in the scandal now, with Chelsea the latest to launch an independent investigation. In 2003, the FA scrapped a flagship project designed to ensure children were protected from sexual violence. It's launched its own internal review into how it's handled abuse in the past. Well, this is a real test now for the FA. Will it be the powerful force for change that survivors are demanding? But football isn't alone in this. The whole of British sport has effectively been told to get its house in order when it comes to issues around safeguarding. The government has written to all sports governing bodies, urging them to assess whether any historical claims of abuse need investigating. And if those who receive elite funding fail to deal robustly with abuse claims, they could face the ultimate punishment.
Well, we would certainly want the sport to evidence the action it's taking to deal with the issue. And if we were concerned in any way with the action, if there was inaction, then that would actually, we would consider our funding relationship with the sport.
For TV presenter Charlie Webster, the tales emerging from former footballers have felt all too familiar. She was abused by her athletics coach at the age of 15, but says it would be a mistake to assume abuse is consigned to the past.
I've worked a lot in the arena of sexual abuse and it's rife, and I feel really sad to say that, but it's the truth, and I think it's about time we acknowledge the truth, that it's not a shock and it is happening right under our noses. And this is a historic case, and I think we need to learn from the historic cases because it's also happening right now.
And that's what football is getting to grips with, confronting the secrets of its past to protect its future. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
Let's go live to Salford and talk to Dan Rowan, our sports editor, who's there. And Dan, is it fair to say that today there's a real sense that this scandal is escalating rapidly?
I think so, Hugh, yes. I mean, I've covered plenty of crises and controversies in British football in recent years, but there's a real sense that this could be now as bad as it gets for the national sport. And as if to underline that, consider this. It's emerging tonight that the helpline set up by the charity, the NSPCC, with the FA to support victims of alleged child sex abuse in the sport has now received 860 calls in just the first week since it was set up. And remarkably, staff at the NSPC have referred 3 times as many cases to the police and other agencies as they had at the same stage of the Jimmy Savile scandal. The scale of this is simply breathtaking, now involving more than a quarter of all police forces and on a daily basis a steady stream now of new victims. But it's also about potential failures by institutions. The more stories emerge of, for example, the FA scrapping funding for a child protection policy research unit back in 2003, for example, or the suggestion that some clubs are signing confidentiality agreements with victims, leaving themselves open to suggestion they're putting reputation and image ahead of openness, the more the sense emerges that the game has harboured an appalling secret, not only that it was used and exploited by paedophiles, but that it missed chances to expose that secret. These truly are dark days for football.
Dan, thanks very much again. Dan Rowan there, our sports editor in Salford. Now, the plane which crashed in Colombia with the Brazilian football team on board had possibly run out of fuel, according to a leaked recording, which seems to feature the pilot making several requests to land. He's also said to mention a total electrical failure on the plane. In Brazil, thousands of people in the town of Chapecoense have held a vigil for the victims. Only 6 of the 77 people on board survived the crash. Our correspondent Ali Makbula sent this report.
A pilot in trouble. Lamia 933 is in total failure, he says. Total electrical failure. No fuel. And there follows a panicked back and forth over navigation. Vectors, the pilot shouts, pleading for directions. It's too late. The control tower desperately asks for the plane's location, but there's no response. The plane had crashed just 8 miles from the runway. All but 6 of the 77 people on board, including most of the Chapecoense football team, wiped out in an instant. They'd taken off from Santa Cruz in Bolivia. The airline director says the pilot had the option of refueling in Bogota, but he chose to carry on to Medellin. It's not clear when he realized he was not going to make it. All 71 bodies have now been recovered.
Because there was no fire involved, the bodies are in relatively good condition, so the identification should be fast. We should complete the process within 2 days.
Well, that fact that the plane didn't burst into flames when it hit the mountains led to rumours right from the beginning that it had run out of fuel. This new audio appears to confirm that and will only add to the anguish of those mourning back home. In southern Brazil, the very stadium where over recent seasons they've watched the stunning rise of their sporting idols has now become a place to grieve together. Even the families of those killed are here. Like Rosangelo Loureiro, widow of the Chapecoense player Kleber. I've been coming here since the accident because staying home is worse, she says. We didn't sleep last night. We just can't sleep. The two of us were together since I was 14 years old. During the day, some have been trying to find solace just by being in the place where the spirit of their heroes will now live on. Tonight there's due to be a far larger gathering remembering the dead before their bodies start to arrive home in the coming days. Alim Makboul, BBC News in Medellin.
Donald Trump says he'll leave his business empire to avoid a conflict of interest after he takes over at the White House. The US president-elect said legal documents were being drafted that would take him completely out of business operations. The president-elect has also announced more key appointments, including the millionaire banker Steven Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary. Our correspondent Sarah Smith has this report.
Trump's business launches are always a family affair. He says being elected president has made the brand even hotter than before. But he does now seem to accept he has to cut ties with his corporation. In 2 weeks' time, he'll tell us how. If he says he's handing over to his children, that will not silence critics who think the president-elect does not truly understand the problem.
We know the close relationship he has with his children. We know that they're involved in the way that he reaches decisions. That would not be a blind trust. That would not be a circumstance where the trustee doesn't have access to the president.
Since his election, Mr. Trump has been seen to mix business with presidency, taking pictures with business partners from India, allowing his daughter Ivanka to sit in on meetings with world leaders like the Prime Minister of Japan. There are Trump Towers in Turkey, the Philippines and India, all places where the president may have some delicate dealings in the next 4 years. This is the brand new Trump Hotel in Washington. And already the Trump Organization are encouraging visiting diplomats to stay here if they're visiting the president. That rather illustrates the larger problem. Even if the family don't seek any special favors, foreign leaders might think there is political advantage in assisting the Trump businesses. Here's the millionaire businessman Steve Mnuchin, who's Trump's choice for Treasury Secretary. He once owned a bank that was called repugnant for unfairly foreclosing on borrowers. Now he's promising tax cuts for middle earners.
Our first priority is going to be the tax plan. And the tax plan has both the corporate aspects to it, lowering corporate taxes so we make U.S. companies the most competitive in the world, making sure we repatriate trillions of dollars back to the United States, and the personal income taxes, where we're going to have the most significant middle income tax cut since Reagan.
Take care of our customers. Thank you.
Donald Trump loves to boast about his wealth, and most of his new cabinet can do the same. So far, his appointees are worth a combined total of over $9 billion. Mitt Romney, personal net worth $250 million, is still hoping to join the club, sharing frog's legs and scallops in Michelin-starred splendour with the man he called a fake and a phony. He'll probably have to eat more humble pie if he really wants to be made Secretary of State. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Washington.
Let's have a brief look then at some of the day's other news stories. Theresa May has defended her decision not to guarantee the rights of EU citizens living in the UK after Brexit. The Prime Minister said that Britons living in the EU would have been left high and dry had she done so. Mrs May was responding to the EU Council President Donald Tusk, who said there could be no deal on expats until formal talks began. Oil prices have surged by 10% after the oil cartel OPEC agreed to cut production for the first time in 8 years. The decision follows more than 2 years of unusually low prices due to a high supply on the market. RBS has failed a Bank of England so-called stress test designed to see how the UK's biggest lenders would cope with another financial crisis. The test questioned how banks would cope with a house price crash and a global recession. RBS, which is three-quarters owned by the government, says it will work to improve its resilience. Now, in the Syrian city of Aleppo, it's being reported that 45 people were killed in the latest bombardment. Aleppo is fast becoming one giant graveyard, according to a senior UN envoy, who's appealed to the Security Council to break the siege of the city. An estimated 25,000 civilians have been displaced from their homes in eastern Aleppo since Saturday, as government forces tighten their grip. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, sent this report from the capital, Damascus, and I should warn you, there are some distressing images in the report.
In Aleppo's war, there's nowhere to hide. This family was bombed even as they fled. The images are too gruesome to show in detail. All they had was each other. Now, not even that.
As my mom was picking up the suitcase, the first of the bombs hit. We ran. My mom was lying here, dead. My sister was lying there. The other one, right beside her, was still alive. We don't know anything about my sister yet. She's at hospital. And then the second bomb hit just here.
Still, the battle goes on. The Syrian military, backed by Iranian and Russian allies, continues its advance deep into the rebel-held enclave, fighting an array of groups, some backed by the West, some linked to Al-Qaeda. Trapped in the middle, tens of thousands of civilians on the run, not sure where to turn. Some speak of threats from rebels too. This woman tells Iranian television she came under sniper fire. We ran fast, she says. Yes, he was sniping at us. Far from this battleground at the United Nations in New York, a war of words over the desperate plight of the people of Aleppo.
History may show that it is perhaps the most horrific conflict of our lifetimes.
If the West are really worried about the situation, they should take practical steps and stop supporting terrorists.
More strong language. There's already been so much and so little impact on the ground. There is some help for those who fled. Shelters in the government-controlled area of West Aleppo, but many are already full. This camp is run by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Their spokesman in Damascus told me, as bad as it is, he fears it will get worse.
The people will be on the move. The people will have to flee their houses. We don't know yet where. We don't know how. Our biggest fear is to guarantee their safety.
Precious moments when life is so precarious. How they matter. When the future for them, their city, remains so uncertain. Lise Doucet, BBC News, Damascus.
Well, the outgoing head of the CIA has strongly criticised the role of Russia in the Syrian conflict, and he's warned Donald Trump to be wary of the Kremlin when he comes to power in January. John Brennan also said he believed it would be disastrous for Mr. Trump to enact many of the foreign policy pledges that he made during his election campaign, including tearing up the nuclear agreement with Iran. He's been speaking exclusively to our security correspondent, Gordon Correra.
He is the man charged with keeping America's secrets and fighting its covert wars around the world. With a new president soon to take office, the director of the CIA spoke to me about the challenges ahead.
Well, first of all, the situation in Syria is heartbreaking. What is happening to Syrian citizens, particularly those in Aleppo, that have been the target of relentless pounding by air as well as by artillery, and the wanton slaughter of civilians that both the Syrians and the Russians are responsible for, is nothing short of outrageous.
But it must be quite frustrating to watch what's happening in Aleppo.
Very frustrating.
And know that there's not much, it appears, that the United States can do about it.
Very frustrating.
The president-elect has suggested he wants to engage with Russia more, to cooperate rather than confront. Do you think that's possible?
President-elect Trump and the new administration need to be wary of Russian promises. Russian promises, in my mind, have not given us what it is that they have pledged.
And there's concern that deals the Obama administration has struck, like over Iran's nuclear program, might now be at risk.
You'll be aware that there are people who would like to tear up that deal, though, here in Washington.
I'm aware of that, yes.
And do you think that would increase or decrease the chance of Iran developing nuclear weapons?
I think it would be disastrous. It really would.
It could lead to a weapons program inside of Iran that could lead other states in the region to embark on their own programs with military conflict. So I think it would be the height of folly if the next administration were to tear up that agreement.
President-elect Trump has also suggested he might bring back the practice of waterboarding detainees. Another mistake, John Brennan says.
Without a doubt, the CIA really took some body blows as a result of its experiences in the detention interrogation program. I think the overwhelming majority of CIA officers would not want to get back into that business.
One notable trait of the incoming administration is their use of language, especially on Islam and terrorism, something which worries the CIA director.
I do think that the new team needs to be disciplined in the language that they use, the messages that they send, because if they're not disciplined, their language will be exploited by the terrorist and extremist organizations as a way to portray the United States and the government as being anti-Islamic, and we're not.
What will you be saying to them when it comes to sitting down and saying, here's the range of covert actions, here's the range of hugely powerful capabilities that are vested in the hands of the CIA?
I want to make sure that they understand what the authorities are the CIA has, what the capabilities are, what programs we might have underway in different parts of the world, so that they are as informed as possible of the facts. I think there are a lot of people out there who read the papers and listen to news broadcasts where the facts may be a bit, off. And so I want to make sure the new team understands what the reality is.
And are you confident from what you've seen so far about which direction they'll take?
I'm confident that I will have the opportunity to express my views to them. It will be up to them. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know.
And that was John Brennan, the outgoing head of the CIA, talking to our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera. Well, Gareth Southgate has been confirmed as the new England football manager on a 4-year contract. He's been the team's interim boss since the departure of Sam Allardyce in September, and he's the 4th permanent manager of the side in as many years. The FA described him today as a winner. Now, they're being called the greatest museums that no one can see, or the weak links in the fight against illegal trade in works of art, which can help to fund terrorist activity. They are free ports, they're the tax-free facilities for goods in transit, and they're springing up across the globe as specialist warehouses to store fine art and antiquities. One of the biggest of them is in Geneva, but its new chairman is determined to bring about change by getting rid of so-called undesirable tenants. He's been speaking to our arts editor, Will Gompertz.
I know, it doesn't look much, does it? A fairly nondescript, grey, windowless block. But it just happens to house, quite possibly, one of the world's greatest collections of art. I'm not talking about a few hundred, apparently that's just the Picassos, or even a few thousand. There are reportedly around 1 million works of art stashed in there. And these surrounding buildings. This is Geneva's Freeport, a guarded, fortified storage facility close to the city centre that acts as a giant lockup for the world's super rich. Here they can secretly store their priceless artworks, away from prying eyes and out of any taxman's reach. Historically, few questions have been asked, meaning nobody actually knows for sure what is hidden behind these locked doors, not even the city's officials or those operating the facility. It's possible that there are objects held in the Freeport which have either been smuggled or possibly Nazi looted.
Yes, it's true, and it's sure.
You are putting your finger on something important. There are so many works of art here. Surely, out of 1 million works, there will be, from time to time, something which will be bad for our reputation.
This rare Etruscan sarcophagus was the cause of one such embarrassment when it was recently discovered among 45 crates of looted antiquities at the Geneva Freeport. The Swiss are worried at a time when the illegal trafficking of artifacts is said to be funding terrorists that there could be more bad news hidden behind their doors.
What we cannot rule out are small items. because there are thousands of small objects from Palmyra in collections, that they are being sold everywhere. The challenge is to find out whether they belong to an old collection or whether they've just been looted.
Would you like the customs or police, or the customs and police, to come in and do a full audit of everything here?
Yes, if everything could be sorted, we would do it. But as you know, a clean slate starting from scratch is not the Swiss mentality.
That said, the Freeport will continue to work on reducing the risk of illegal activities. But it can do nothing about the fact that art has become a commodity to be traded, not seen. Great masterpieces can be incarcerated here for decades. This art has, as one curator said ruefully, been put into a coma. Will Gompertz, BBC News, Geneva.
Quick reminder that Newsnight is coming up on BBC Two, and here's Evan.
We'll hear from Cherie Blair tonight. She doesn't do many interviews, but she talks to us about the Blair brand, her husband taking a bigger role in politics, and the issue she's most passionate about, women and their role. Join me now on BBC Two, 11 p.m. in Scotland.
So Newsnight with Evan coming up, and here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.